Well, this morning we're going to continue on as we've been doing through the entire year, working our way through the Bible. And this is one of those weeks that is interesting to me because I've told you before it's 66 books in 50 weeks. The math doesn't add up unless you kind of double up every now and then. Well, this is a triple up. I don't think I've done 3 books in one Sunday before. Luckily, though, they're all fairly short and they're all fairly similar. It's the pastoral epistles, otherwise known as 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. I don't know about you, but many people have come up to me when I said that I'm preaching on Timothy and Titus, and they're like, what? Those are actually books? Many people haven't read them. Or they're really excited because they want me to find one thing that they really like in one of these books. But that's often the case with any one of them. These are interesting books for me as a pastor because these books are really about the way in which we share in that leadership model of passing on generational or I don't know what other way to say it, but generational or leadership-specific qualities to each successive group so that they can do their work. So I'm going to give you my study guide notes, and then we're going to break down and see if we can make some sense of what I asked you to read this week. Now, first off, the authorship is Paul. Like so many of the other books, we assume it's Paul writing to people, but he's writing this collective work to elevate a couple of people to pastoral ministry. Now, when you think of pastoral ministry, usually you think of someone like me. You think of someone who stands up front, and if you don't think of me, you think of maybe one of my predecessors or someone else. You might think of someone who wore robes a lot. Those are hot, friends. Choir, you can attest, like from having to wear those in the past, right? But you often also think of somebody who not only speaks for roughly a half hour at a time on your Sunday, but somebody who can be there for your wedding or your funeral, somebody who can be there for your counseling, somebody who has these generalized skills and tendencies. I say that because a lot of times when we think of a pastor, we think of a very specific role that they have to fulfill. I know growing up, I thought that pastors had to be only one way, and what I've learned is that pastors need to be as unique as the churches are. How many of you have been to another church? Quit skipping. All right. But if you've been to another church, you understand that they probably have a whole different set of needs and skills, a different life cycle they might be in, a different neighborhood with different kinds of qualities, a different theme and style. I grew up going to a Baptist church. The pastor was a Bible thumper. By the way, if anyone wants to get good at it, you get a small Bible about this size, leather. You hold your thumb in the center. Perfect curvature, okay? And all these kinds of things come together, right? We have these kinds of tendencies. But pastors are unique to the neighborhood just as the church is that they're in. With Timothy and Titus, we're going to have 2 individuals who are called to do relatively the same thing, but they're called to do it within the skills and the giftings that each one of them have so that they could speak uniquely to the churches they were called to, okay? The dating of this we assume to be the mid-60s, not 1960s, that's long hair and different style, but to Paul in the 60s, he's near the end of his life, especially in 2nd Timothy. We believe that that might be his last letter that he ever wrote. He's really worn out in that letter in some regards. He's looking for Timothy to come and give him help. Audience, Timothy, a beloved leader who was like a son to Paul, and Titus, who was a strong Greek leader. Right? They're going to have their unique giftings used independently. The reason that they wrote these letters was to develop the leaders and to make sure that the church was in a place so that it could do the primary work that Paul sought to do, which was evangelism, to share the good news of Jesus. Have you ever seen some group, organization, or even a church get thrown off of the course of what they should be doing? No. Say it ain't so. Right? The church is that way in this moment. They're kind of off course. There's a lot of distractions hitting them, and it's largely due to the behavior and the work of people. What happens when you have a group of 3 or more people? A mess, right? Have you ever had 3 siblings together? I grew up with 5 within 3 years of age. What happened all the time? Warring. That's the best way to describe it. And people are the same way. When we get large groups of people together, we might love each other passionately, but we can't help ourselves. We're hot messes. We like to gossip. We like to point fun. We like to be engaged in this way. And I'm not trying to be mean to anybody in particular. If you feel guilty this morning, that's on you. It's okay. But we always have had this kind of experience. We've always had this kind of struggle. And Paul's writing to churches that are dealing with it. And they're writing to churches who are dealing with this, and as we'll see as we go through this, because largely the people that he's writing to have not yet been invested in enough to be able to become leaders yet. And so he sends more mature leaders to re-engage the process of leadership development. It's really fascinating when you break it down that way. The theme of these books is leadership's role in the church and what doctrine might look like. Some words that you might use as you're going through these books is faith, good deeds, endurance, doctrine, abide, and grace. And just as a basic, like small level introduction to these two books, we assume Timothy might have been more timid, but really I don't like to argue that way because he gets sent to kind of a hostile environment anyway. I think calling him timid was an underestimation. It's just the scope that Titus had to deal with in Crete. He's dealing with a real hot mess. Timothy is just a mild hot mess that he's dealing with, okay? And so Timothy is going to be in Ephesus, a really pronounced community. Titus is being sent as this stronger Greek person to deal with the church in Crete. The church in Crete is fascinating. It's an island, and if you've ever heard someone being called a Cretan, this is where they get it from, right? The word in Greek that they use to describe the people of Crete literally translates into liars. When I think of this community and this town, I think of every pirate movie that Disney has ever made, right? You imagine that you have Jack Sparrow as your primary mayor type person in this situation leading the church. I don't know about you, but that's probably entertaining for the first hour, and after that, it's a little long in the tooth and a little hard to be around. That's the kind of community that is in this Crete community. They're known for being liars, and I'm going to tell you that because when you think about the damage that they're doing to themselves, they haven't had yet time to rebirth their identity. They haven't reshaped themselves fully. They've had a long history of this identity. If you've ever been to a community that's shaped by a common core identity, reshaping it is difficult. I think of so many communities that I got introduced to when I lived in Colorado that used to be mining communities. And when the mines closed up, the people still wanted to have the mining community mentality, which was tough and hard and vigorous. And yet they had to reshape themselves because many of those communities that did not reshape themselves simply died. And so what we need to think about is how do we reshape community? Are you ready to jump in, see what this is like? Let's give it a try. All right, like I said, both of these books are about persons who were sent out to be pastoral leaders in the community. And one of the things I always like to think about when I believe we're about to get into this kind of a conversation is the fact that all of us need leaders. All of us. We yearn for leadership. Now, even as your pastor, I look for leadership. As a pastor, I look for leadership, and not everyone gets to see that. Because most people, when we think of the church, we think of the local church. We think of who we are, and we think of the couple hundred of us that come together every weekend to praise God and to bear witness to our faith and try to live within a common set of goals and dreams of taking care of the community in Pekin, and we think that we need a pastor at least to lead us through. Somebody who can be there for us and give us comfort in our times of needing comfort. Somebody who might correct us if the ship's off course. But really, we see that. But what we don't see often is that I have leadership. I have a group of individuals within our church that can tell me, Eric, you're off the rails again. Would you get it together? It's happened. It'll happen again, I promise. I'm not known always for being the best of mentalities, all right? But then we have district superintendents and bishops and a board of ordained ministry and other clergy colleagues and friends. I tell you this because the church has always had this multi-generational, multi-stepped process of leadership. Paul was simply a part of that process. So was Peter. So were so many other early church leaders that were respected as he was. And they would commission people to go out and do the work of the church. In pastoral leadership is what we would understand it. But again, everyone's pastoral leadership looks different. I remember before I came here, I had a call from our bishop asking me to consider taking a different appointment. Don't worry, it wasn't at the same time. They weren't fighting over me. It's okay. But he called me up and he asked me and he told me about this church and I prayed about it and I told him no. First off, jaws off the ground. You can tell a bishop no. But I told him no because they needed somebody with what we usually think of as pastoral care. When we think of a deep sense of empathy, the ability to sit patiently with somebody, the ability to help them process a system of grieving that they were going through. And friends, I can do those things to an extent, but there are colleagues of mine who are far better at it. What the church needed was not what I was gifted with. No matter if I thought the opportunity would have been good or bad, was indifferent in this moment. Having the wisdom to understand that there's different kinds of pastoral care was the first part of this decision. I tell you this because we're also part of a church collectively. And whether you want to ever have the title of pastor next to your name or not is not the issue to me. I believe that everyone has a calling into ministry. Everyone. I believe that you have the gifting and the gracing to serve the church in a capacity that mentors and leads others. And that we need to reuse that gifting. I start there because when Paul is commissioning these two individuals, he's sending them out. He's taking them out of their comfort zone where they've been nurtured and grown and taken care of. And he sends them into a community. And he sends them into the community to change them and to transform them. Not to do so in a way that is negative, but to do so in a way that is life-giving, affirming, and uplifting. To do so in a way that helps people as well as challenges people to live more fully into the image of the life and death and ministry of Jesus Christ than the one they've been living in the moment. Each of us might be called to do so. In fact, as we lit candles, I remember many of the people in my life who I have lit a candle for who challenged me deeply and said, "Eric, get your act together." Whether they were a pastor or not, who mentored me in the faith, who loved me in my mistakes, who corrected me and allowed me to become the better version of myself that I am today. I pray that that's the type of spirit in which you are lighting candles in this moment. And I want you to know that the beginning of these letters, we're looking at Paul sending into the community this space. Now, in Timothy, let's look at the uniqueness of what he's facing. In the work that we have in Timothy, the first one, the verse I had you read was, "I hope to come to you quickly, but I'm writing these things to you so that if I'm delayed, you'll know how you should behave in God's household." I love Paul. He's kind of snarky in this moment, and we miss it, right? He starts off and he goes, "I hope to be with you, but if I can't, ... What he's really doing is, he goes, "I'm in prison right now. If I tell you that I hope to be with you, maybe this will come across as a little bit softer, right? I would love to do this in person, but because I can't, here's Timothy. Good luck, kid." And it's a support to Timothy, but it's also an opening of the door to the community he's writing to. He's wise in how he's doing this. He sends it out, and then he sends Timothy, and he lets them know in the hearing of this that his purpose is in how you should behave in God's household. Anytime you hear that, take a big gulp backwards and get ready to hear some things that challenge you. Be willing to take a moment and say, maybe I've done this wrong. Now, that is one of the worst feelings in the world, hearing, I've done this wrong. I still have vivid remembrances of telling my children that they were wrong. I still do it. You know how fun it is? Not very. In part because I'm their dad, I want them to succeed. In part because they're human, and they act like humans when you tell them they're wrong, violently. Right? It's a test of endurance. And if you think kids are the only ones to do so, I've seen some adults act quite like kids. Unfortunately, I probably have too. We own that, don't we? And so we see this moment in which he's sending somebody to do corrective work. Now, when Timothy was going to do corrective work, as I told you, he might get the label as being timid, but let me tell you a little bit about the church situation he had. He had situations where, like an example of one of them, was that he had a lot of widows who were coming to the church seeking to have the financial support of the church, the food support of the church, the ability to survive support of the church. Because in that day and age, if you were widowed, you didn't have Social Security, you didn't have some kind of fallback, and in fact, you didn't have rights, because your rights always went with the male heir. And if you were truly widowed, you didn't have anyone to connect to. But the problem is that Paul and Timothy in this community, they knew that the church was full of generosity, and so many people who were younger, who had already had a little bit of time to go through the grieving process, were committed to staying within that cycle and not moving on. And so Paul was sending Timothy to help people move on in this process. Another pocket of resistance that he had was the old men in the church. Now, old men have never been problems in church, have they? What he had in this case, though, was he had a lot of old men who should have been wise leaders. When we think of the Greco-Roman world, if you were an old man, that means you survived death countless times. You better be wise and not just lucky. And what they were supposed to do were be pillars of the community with good faith. And you know what Timothy inherited? The guys that really liked their wine, the drunkards. He had a bunch of guys that were kind of like some of the folks around that would just open the garage door up, pop a top, and call it a day at 10 o'clock in the morning. Right? That's how he had it in this moment. And he was trying to correct them because they were expecting to have the statutes and positions of power and authority, but they themselves weren't taking care of themselves and or the community around them. This is just an example of the type of situation Timothy found himself in. But in this situation, what Timothy had to do was step into the space, call people out of the places where they were abusing power, and then re-engage. What Timothy did in many regards was pull people away from those positions of power, give it to those who were already matured, but then he did something unique. He engaged them, the people that he had removed from power. He would re-engage them and re-teach them how to be in that space. He would re-counsel them, so to speak. Now, I tell you that because what would it be if you were somebody who heard about the good news of Jesus, you said, I'm going to follow Jesus, and then that person told you, you need to have a new life? You might get a little grumpy about that. You might feel a little bit bitter about that. You might be scared about that. You might be excited about it, but don't know how to do it. Many of us, in the moment in which we find new life, need to go through a process of transition. That process might include grieving the life we once had. That process might mean healing from abuse that we experienced, either inflicted by ourselves or somebody else. That process might take time for us to develop new habits and new patterns. How many of you, when you lace up your tennis shoes, go on a run, come back in the house, go, I'm a runner, I'm going to do it every day? Ha! Thank you for laughing. At least somebody has tried that. None of us are perfect in the first moment. It takes a long time to develop healthy patterns, to reshape ourselves. Timothy was reshaping people and reshaping his church. He gets to be successful at it. I think that's why Paul considered him beloved, almost like a son. And what we noticed in 2 Timothy is that Paul writes back to him. And Paul writes back to him and says, Timothy, I hope that you will come and visit me. I hope that you would come and visit me in this moment. And one of the things that's powerful to me is that when we think about doing leadership well, we need to understand that the best thing we can ever do as a leader is help those who we lead become better than us. That's always my goal. I want to leave a trail of people who could just wipe the floor with what I'm doing. I want people who are that good coming behind me that when I am in need of counsel or in need of support, that I can call the people that I've poured into because they're doing that well, that they can come and love and support and counsel and correct me. It has developed a transitional leadership model. Earlier today, I was talking to a group of individuals, and I said that I believe in a multi-generational church, and I mean it. For a long time, I remember the church was getting hyper-focused, and we used that terminology, and I think we do need to be hyper-focused on our community, on how we're going to grow and reach and connect with our community, instead of assuming that every community is like one another. But the problem when we sometimes get hyper-focused is that we look past some of the people in our community because we're human and we have affinity. And our affinity is to people who look like us, sound like us, all the us pieces. If we're a teacher, we want to be with other teachers. Why? Because we want to commiserate. If we're people who are blacksmiths, we might work with people who work with their hands, right? We always want to do the thing with the people who are most like us. And what often happens is that everyone looks like us, and then when we are done, so is our church. To be a multi-generational church is to be a church that accepts that we pass and hand down the mantle of leadership, because at some point we will need leaders to lead us in that next season of our lives. And that's what Paul's understanding was. And in 2 Timothy, we get a taste of that leadership model. We get to see it being done well. I always tell people all the time that I don't know what the next 5 years, 10 years, and even 15 years of ministry look like, but I sure know what the last 5 years of my ministry look like. I hope to become an associate pastor somewhere, because then I want to just clear the way for some young punk version of me, give them all the credit for the things that go right, take all the blame for the things that get wrong, and smile the whole time I'm doing it. Because hopefully I'll have passed on some intergenerational leadership and being able to handle the stage of life that I'll have been in at that time well. How many of us ever plan to do that, to pass it down well? That's what he's teaching us in 2 Timothy. In the book of Titus, we kind of restart the notion a little bit. We have this other leader. And as I told you, the island of Crete is this amazing island because it's a hub, it's a port, it's a networking place. And Paul wants this island to succeed because he understands that to be effective at evangelism, we need a network to get outward. And the port cities, the cities where commerce came in and commerce went out, were the best thing that they had at their day and age. They didn't have the telephone, they didn't have printing presses, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have cable TV or whatever vogue thing we're using in this moment to get the gospel out with. They had port cities. And so what you would hopefully do is go to a port city, build a healthy church, and then allow people to come in and see the church, and then spread it back out to their homes and their communities. Paul knew that this was vital and important. The problem is with port cities is you get pirates. At least that's what I think of them. You get people who are on the kind of the ragged edge of life and living. Have you ever seen that kind of community before? Maybe not real pirates, but people who kind of act like it. You ever stop at a truck stop at 2 o'clock in the morning? Not to knock my trucker friends, I know many people who do it, but there's just a different edge in that community because they've seen it all. They've been a part of it all. There's a little bit of craftiness and cleverness that's on the edge of survival in this space, and that's what they are. And so when Titus gets sent to this church, he's got people who are doing all kinds of things that are out of order. Kind of like with Timothy, you got people who are drunkards and stuff like that, but you also have all kinds of even next level cantankerous steps people were going out of bounds with. People were doing things that were, as I think about it, these three things. One, they were doing harm to themselves with some of the practices they couldn't give up. Anytime we're sinning, we're often doing harm against ourselves. They were doing things that distracted and harmed their families or their closest colleagues. Oftentimes when we are in hurt situations or we are broken, we do brokenness upon other people. Hurt people do hurtful things is a way I often say it. And then those two things combined together with the nature of the church and the hyper-localized church that they had in these house churches meant that the integrity of the church was lost. Have you ever seen a church or a community or an organization that somebody who was in leadership did something unethical and the entire community failed? Yeah, we all have. I've made phone calls and walked onto doorsteps to confront people about it, understanding that in my confrontation of doing the right thing in this moment meant that the thing that we all had supported in the past was dead. That's kind of what Timothy has to go to, or Titus has to go to, sorry, Timothy. Titus has to go there and speak to this level of community. And so when he goes there, he does very similarly. He removes people from institutions of power. He goes to them And what he tries to do is he needs them to learn that these new leaders that they're going to appoint and the old leaders need to now learn is that we need to make ourselves into a new humanity, not the old one. You see, we have an identity and a culture around us. If you were from Crete, you had a culture and identity that was born in craftiness, wiliness, lying. If everyone knew you as a liar, you might own that identity. You might own it too powerfully. If you were known as being that kind of a person, you might become proud of it, even if you knew it was on the ragged edge of things. And so what Paul needed them to do is understand that the entire community needed to experience its identity in Jesus. And Jesus' identity was the opposite of the Cretan one, and he knew that it would take time for them to understand that the kindness and the love of Jesus needed to be renewed within them, rebirthed within them. They needed to be washed clean, and they needed to be in a powerful way of living that would declare that the Spirit that filled them with faithfulness to Jesus and would declare grace to the world. What Timothy would have to do is give people the time to mourn and grieve the transition that they were going through, and so that they can then celebrate the new life that God was doing in them. He needed to understand that this would take more time than the average bear, because that's how long it would take for the person to be transformed and the community around it. I think far too often when we help somebody experience new life in Jesus, that we hope that the very next minute that they would be ready to be our next great leader because they have a great story to tell. And we don't understand that the process of sitting and wrestling with them is one that takes daunting amounts of energy. He was sent to this community, Titus, because he had the ability to probably share his experience and pastor to them uniquely in a way that transformed them. And because of the transformation that the people in Crete and Ephesus saw, we today get to see how transitional leadership that goes on from generation to generation can give us the kind of church that continues to proclaim that new humanity, that new kind of love that we find in Jesus Christ. Let us pray. God, I give you thanks for the early church. I give you thanks for Timothy and for Titus, for the way in which they faced the obstacles and challenges that you placed before them, and they moved forward in a new kind of love and new kind of hope. I pray that you challenge us to do so as well, to listen to each other and respect one another, to help call into ministry new generations of leaders successfully and successively, so that the church may continue in its ever-present work until such time that you come again. It's in Jesus' name.